You all know that Solomon's temple was first constructed in Jerusalem in 957 BCE. It was sacked, reconstructed, destroyed, and then in 538 BCE rebuilt, only to be finally destroyed again by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. A Jewish temple stood in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. From that moment to this one, for over 2 millennia, Jews living outside the land of their fathers have longed for the reconstitution of Jewish sovereignty in the homeland of the Jewish people. It's a wish that is embedded in their weekly and daily prayer, a wish that consummates Jewish holidays, the birth of Jewish children. It is a hope intoned to uplift Jewish mourners as they grieve. Longing for Zion has been at the core of Jewish survival and at the heart of Jewish memory. It's been one of the fundaments of Jewish identity throughout the history of Western civilization. In the 19th century, a period of emerging nation states, the Jews too began their recovery of their national homeland, then occupied by the Ottoman Empire. And the Balfour Declaration we commemorate today, on its 100th anniversary, was a vital way station along the road to the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty in the historic land of Israel. In our discussion now, we're going to try and understand how the Balfour Declaration came about. And the first thing to understand is that by World War I, the Ottomans had reigned over the historic land of Israel for about 400 years. They were then allied with Germany, Bulgaria, Austria, Hungary, allied against France, Russia, Britain, and eventually the United States. And by 1917, Britain was thinking about how to deal with the defeat of her enemies, how to administer the lands vacated by they thought and hoped, the defeated Ottoman Empire. So I think to understand the Balfour Declaration, to understand its story, we need to bring together 3 or 4 different strands. We need to see how the approach to the British was conceptualized and executed as the product of Zionist statesmanship by men like Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, Nachum Sokolow, and Walter Rothschild. I think we need to see it in the context of British popular sentiment and the philo-Semitism that can be seen in pieces like George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, a novel that was written that made the case for the recovery of the Jews of their homeland decades before Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress. Finally, I think we need to see the issuance of the Balfour Declaration in light of the debates unfolding within the British government, and to see how it was thought to serve not only, and perhaps not even primarily, Jewish interests, but indeed served British interests. Now, the Balfour Declaration, I think you know, was a letter addressed to a leader of the Jewish community in England, Lord Walter Rothschild, from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, and it served as a statement of British policy. Dated November 2nd, 1917, 100 years ago, this is what the letter read. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. Now let's try now to inhabit the mindset of a cabinet official in Prime Minister David Lloyd George's government to enter the room of decision during the First World War and begin to try to understand how the issuance of that letter could have served British war aims. Mike, I'd like to begin with you, and I thought what we could do is ask you to begin by laying out the arguments prevalent against the issuance of Balfour. Against. Then I'll ask Doug to help us see how those arguments were countered and what it was about David Lloyd George's war concept that led it to ultimately prevail.
Okay, thanks, John. And first of all, thanks for moderating this. You do a great job at Tikva, so thank you. And I just want to thank Doug Feith for joining us, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He hired me at the Pentagon. I'm always grateful to him, and he's also, I think he was president of creation at JINSA. And I think the youngest member in that basement, is that right? So thank you, Doug, and he's been very helpful since to me, giving me good advice. The issue, the argument against the Balfour Declaration, those who argued against it inside the cabinet? Well, there were a couple. So there was, well, by the time in 1917, I think one of the main opponents was a Jew, Lord Montagu. Was a cousin of Herbert Samuel, who was government. Sorry, I think that's mine. Who actually introduced the idea to the cabinet in 1915. But Montagu was one of these Jews in England who was very concerned that the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of a Jewish homeland would actually undermine his position in England. And actually, I think he had decent reason to think such. I mean, I'll just mention something. He subsequently became Secretary of India, if I recall correctly. And there was a famous massacre in India. And the general there, General Dyer, I think they killed about 400 people in Amritsar, is that right? I remember reading a leading MP, I think it was Austin Chamberlain, conservative MP, writing about Montagu. Montagu fired the general for this massacre, and referring to Montagu, he was writing to sister, I think, Austin Chamberlain, who said, that foreigner, that Jew, rounding on an Englishman. And it always struck me, you know, how a number of Englishmen distinguished the Jew from an Englishman, right? He's a foreigner, he's not a Jew. So imagine, I mean, you can imagine in his head, well, if you establish a Jewish homeland, people are going to say, well, why don't you go live there? Why should you live here? And I think Montagu was genuinely concerned about that. And I think he was by 1917, he was one of the key opponents of that, I think. And there were anti-Semites also in the cabinet, but some of them supported for other reasons, but that's not really your question. Right?
Was there a strategic case against it?
Sorry.
I'd like to just jump in on the point about Montagu.
Yeah.
First of all, I mean, in addressing it's a little odd that we're addressing the question what the opposition to the Balfour Declaration was before we talk about why anybody proposed it to begin with. But anyway, as long as we're doing that, there were, in the cabinet deliberations, which were basically taking place in September and October of 1917, there were two members of the war cabinet, two people within the war cabinet deliberations who spoke against the Balfour Declaration. One of them was Montagu, and the other was Lord Curzon. Now, the arguments were, Montagu's argument was, as Mike rightly pointed out, that a declaration that the Jews are a people and that they have a homeland and that it's in Palestine was viewed by Montagu as a statement that would undermine the status of the Jews in England. He made this argument in a passionate way, in a way that discomfited his colleagues because it was so passionate, it was so intemperate. In fact, it was so stupid that it infuriated and embarrassed his colleagues, who knew that what he was saying was wrong because they knew what their own attitude was. He actually wrote a memorandum, the title of which is The Anti-Semitism of the Present Government. Can you imagine? I mean, here's a Jewish guy who was at the time the Secretary of State for Indian Affairs.
At the time.
He was a cousin of, as you pointed out, of Herbert Samuel, who had been the most high-ranking Jew in the British government when the war started. He was Home Secretary in the Asquith government. And Montagu was making the argument, which was a fascinating, inconsistent argument. On the one hand, he said, the Jews don't need an endorsement of this kind. They don't need a homeland established in Palestine. The Jews in England are fine, and we're well assimilated, and all's well. In the same memorandum in which he said that, he said, and if the British government endorses the idea of a Jewish home in Palestine, then everybody in England and throughout the rest of the world will want to expel their Jews to that homeland. And which of course is a completely inconsistent argument. I mean, either you're comfortable and you don't need it, or the Jews are hanging by a thread, in which case they really do need it. And so he was completely inconsistent, and that was noticed by people. And he made the argument in such personal, passionate terms that people winced. I mean, he was an insecure guy. He specifically said in this memorandum, how could I serve to represent His Majesty's government if the British government says that the Jews have a homeland elsewhere? And from the point of view of the people who supported, for various strategic and humanitarian reasons, the Balfour Declaration, principally the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, they said this is crazy, because I mean, we understand that the status of the Jews in England is not going to be undermined in any way. Anyway, to shut him up, they added, I think it's like 9 words at the end of the Balfour Declaration, which you read, which said, nothing in this declaration is going to affect the status of Jewish communities outside of Palestine. So that was that. And that was the argument about Montagu. The other voice that was raised, which was much more serious in the War Cabinet deliberations, was Lord Curzon's. And Curzon was actually a member of the War Cabinet. Montagu was not, but was invited to join the debate because he was a prominent Jew in the government, the only Jew in the government. So Curzon spoke with great authority. Curzon was a very important guy. He had been Viceroy of India, and he later, fairly soon thereafter, succeeded Arthur Balfour as Foreign Secretary in the fall of 1919. Now, Curzon made an argument in a brilliant memorandum, the gist of which was, Zionism can't work. He said, Palestine is in terrible shape. It can't support a large number of additional people. It's economically impossible. And there are 2 main reasons why Zionism can't work. One is the land could be cultivated, he said, only by a people inured to agriculture. And he then said, like, Jewish talents lie elsewhere. I mean, it was an extremely elegant and clever memorandum. So he said, the Jews can't farm. Which, by the way, empirically, he had a good basis for that assertion. That was not an absurd assertion at the time. You couldn't point to a lot of successful Jewish farmers on any kind of substantial scale to suggest that Palestine was going to be made fruitful by a people who had never proven themselves as particularly brilliant in agriculture in the last 2,000 years. The other thing he said was that there would be a constant danger because the overwhelming majority of the people in the country at that time were Arabs who were not happy with the idea that the Jews would come in large numbers into Palestine. And he said, basically, they're going to require protection from an outsider, from the outside power like Britain forever. So his argument boiled down to 2 things. The Jews can't farm and the Jews can't fight. Again, not a foolish argument under the circumstances of the time, but it turned out to be wrong. What is particularly interesting is Sir Mark Sykes, the Sykes of the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement, who was one of the 3 assistant secretaries of the War Cabinet and was a strong proponent, in many ways was a key mover of the Balfour Declaration. Mark Sykes was so struck by Lord Curzon's arguments that he understood how important it was to counter them. So he wrote a memorandum for Balfour, which Balfour then used in the cabinet deliberations to answer Curzon. And in this memorandum, and it's a stunning memorandum, Sykes explains what the economic potential of Palestine is, based on recent trends and based on a really brilliant analysis of how the land properly governed and properly cultivated, properly developed, could be much more prosperous than it has been, since biblical times. And he wrote this terrific memorandum, which he gave to Balfour. Balfour, on the day that this was debated and decided, which was October 31st, used the Sykes memorandum and made the argument and carried the day. And so those were the two main arguments were the Montague argument, which made everybody kind of cringe because it was so personal and so ridiculous, and then the Curzon arguments, which were completely sensible and quite credible, but wrong.
Could I? I'm sorry, but I would like to defend Montague a little more on this. The nervous Jew who was anti-Zionist. First of all, in his defense, again, I think the Zionists, the argument you're saying that Montague said is right. And by the way, Doug's research is fresher than mine. It's been a while since I delved in through all these documents. So he remembers certainly more than I do. But the Zionist, one of the Zionist arguments, I mean, let me be clear. One of Theodor Herzl's arguments was, because Herzl, just be clear, in his, the Jew state, or what's commonly interpreted as the Jewish state, but it's really the Jew state, pamphlet in 1896, and that really starts and then it's Basel, the first Zionist Congress, the following year. But one of his arguments, if I recall correctly, is that he's appealing to the anti-Semites, partly in this pamphlet. He doesn't appeal to Gentile hearts. He's appealing to Gentile minds. He's not appealing to the non-Jewish countries. He's looking for great power support. He's not assuming that they're going to be sympathetic to the Jews. In fact, that's the whole point. He doesn't think the world is sympathetic to the Jews at all, and that's why they need their own state. So he's not going to really, he doesn't try to appeal to their hearts to say that the Jews should have a state, because that's the wrong way he's thinking about it. If he thought that that would be effective, he wouldn't have thought so much of Zion, that the Jews need a state. On the contrary, he thinks that anti-Semitism is unrelenting. The Dreyfus Affair shows that even in a more liberal state like France, that it's impossible for the Jews, they need their own state. So he has no faith in the Gentiles at all. So what does he try to do? He tries to appeal to the way they think, to their own anti-Semitism. He basically uses anti-Semitism as a club against the anti-Semites. Well, that's how I see it, Doug. I'll just say we have a real argument. But I would say, and one of his arguments is that get the Jews, that this will be a vehicle, a Jewish state will be a vehicle for some of these countries to get rid of their Jews. Because the perception is, certainly among some of the ruling powers, is that the Jews are troublemakers, that they're seen, and this goes back even earlier in the 19th century in other turbulence in Europe, where the Jews are seen certainly by the leadership as part of the revolutionaries. This has always been kind of the thing, and Sykes actually puts it very well in Parliament in 1922. There are those who see the Jews as rich and part of the establishment, and the others see them as left-wing troublemakers. Either way, you can't win, right? And he sees, one of his arguments, I think, to the powers is, get rid of the Jews. This will be a way to siphon off the Jews. They'll go to Palestine, and you'll have a more stable rule. So the fact that Montague says, as you say, is, to me, in a way, not so crazy, considering that that's exactly one of Herzl's arguments, I think. I mean, the whole, and this gets to another point, but I think one of the things that the Zionists do is, because they have almost no tools, I mean, is that they try to use the anti-Semites' arguments against them for a Jewish state. That's how I see it.
That's a way of explaining a phenomenon. I would explain it a little differently. There's no question that the key motive behind, a key motive behind Zionism was to deal with the problem of Jew hatred. So anti-Semitism is crucial to everybody's argument about Zionism. What Montague did that I said was stupid was failing to distinguish between the situation of the Jews in a place like Russia and the situation of the Jews in a place like Britain. And that really was just dumb and insulting to his colleagues. And his colleagues treated it as not a worthy argument. And I mean, and the fact that Theodor Herzl understood the practical point that in a world that does have a lot of anti-Semitic, look, the main pool of Jews in the world was in Russia. There were millions of Jews, 5 million? Or, I mean, I forget the exact number at the time. But there was a large number of Jews in the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire was viciously anti-Jewish and had for decades supported attacks on the Jews known as pogroms. And it was clear that those people were in extremis. Herzl and other leading Zionists believed that there was an urgency that Jew hatred had evolved through the 19th century so that it was now part of popular politics, because basically there was a democratization that had occurred throughout the 19th century. And so politics became popular politics. And a key part of popular politics in Europe and even in relatively enlightened places like Vienna and Paris was anti-Semitism. And you began to get the creation of political parties. By the way, you could see resonance for today in Europe and in the United States. The idea that you have political parties that use as one of their main platforms an anti-alien or anti-immigrant line, that's something that you saw in the late 19th century in Europe. And you began to get political parties, some of which actually adopted the name, things like La Ligue Antisémitique, or in Germany, that's where the word anti-Semitism came from. The first use of the term anti-Semitism was in the early 1870s by a German journalist who formed a political party, and he called it the Anti-Semitic Party, which was basically a fancy way of referring to Jew hatred, tying into the academic linguistic terminology of the day, where races were identified by language. So the Jews were referred to as Semites, which was kind of a newfangled academic thing at the time. And so what struck Herzl and others who created the political Zionism movement was the problem of anti-Semitism. And what motivated them was the sense that trends in Europe, rather than heading toward greater liberality, were heading toward an intensification of racial hatred against the Jews, not just religious-based, but racial hatred against the Jews, and that the trends were growing violent. And the violent rhetoric of anti-Semitic politicians in Vienna and in Paris in connection with the Dreyfus trial made a very big impression on Herzl and motivated him to basically to organize, which is what Herzl did, to organize this love of the homeland and desire to return to the homeland among Jews into a political movement.
So let's go back to London now and try to see why it was that Curzon's arguments and Montague's arguments failed to win the day. Why did the Balfour Declaration at the end of the day pass?
I think to understand it, it helps to start with the observation that when the British entered World War I, right, when the guns of August began firing in the summer of 1914, the British Prime Minister was Asquith. And he brought Field Marshal Kitchener, who was the leading British war hero of the day, back from Egypt. He had been running Egypt for the British. He brought him back, and the two of them decided that the Middle East was of no interest to Britain. And Asquith's policy was, we are not interested in the Holy Land, we are not interested in the Middle East. The war is going to be fought and determined on the Western Front. And that was the view of the civilian leadership of the British government, and it was the view of the military leadership of the British government. The war for 2.5 years was fought in a disastrous fashion, and the casualties were astonishing. I mean, there were battles that in a few weeks killed scores of thousands. There were some battles that killed 100,000 people in a 2 or 3 month period. Right? I mean, think about it, to put it in scale, the United States in Vietnam over a dozen years lost about 55,000 fatalities. And they had days, literally days, where 20,000 people got killed. So Lloyd George was a member of the Asquith cabinet. Asquith was a liberal. Lloyd George was also a liberal. Lloyd George was one of the most brilliant and productive, energetic members of the Asquith cabinet. And he managed in December 1916 to basically conduct a parliamentary coup against Asquith and got him out because the war was going so badly, it was stalemated, and Lloyd George came in. And Lloyd George believed that the whole strategy that the British government, civilian and military leaders had been pursuing from the beginning was foolish, unimaginative, and doomed. And he was the leader of what was known as the Easterners' school. He said, the military is wrong when they say the war is going to be determined on the Western Front. The war is going to be determined by knocking Turkey out of the war. And that was Lloyd George's key strategic view. Now, the British had tried to knock Turkey out of the war early on with the famous Gallipoli campaign, which was a disaster. That was over, and they weren't going to retry a direct attack against Turkey. The British already had Egypt. So if you're going to attack Turkey, but you're not going to attack it directly, and you're sitting in Egypt already, that basically means you're going to attack Palestine and Syria. And Lloyd George believed that it was not only worthwhile, he believed it was the key to victory in the war that the British should conquer Palestine and Syria and knock the Turks out of the war. And he said, if we knock the Turks out of the war, the Germans will have to surrender. And when he got into office in December 1916, it was literally within about 48 hours that he asked the military for a campaign plan to invade Palestine. Now, he did something else within the first day or two of his term as prime minister. Lloyd George was the first poor guy to be prime minister of England. He grew up in a house without running water. He was prime minister because of this democratization trend that I mentioned. He was prime minister because the nature of British politics had changed. And public opinion mattered. He understood that better than anybody else in the government. And with that in mind, he said, and he said it within, as I said, about 48 hours of becoming prime minister, he said, I want a worldwide propaganda campaign for the Allies. And they wanted to make propaganda in Greece, in Italy, in Russia, in America, worldwide. And I believe if you want to understand why the Balfour Declaration was eventually issued by the British government, it was for these two reasons. That Lloyd George decided, contrary to Asquith, that the British did want to conquer Palestine and that it was important to their war effort. And secondly, that there needed to be a worldwide propaganda campaign, an element of which was to appeal to Jews and Jewish communities to give the Jews an incentive to support the Allied war effort. And that's what led Lloyd George to then turn to Mark Sykes, who was the leading Middle East advisor to the War Cabinet at the time. And he said to Sykes, let's make a declaration. This is an idea that had been kicking around, but it didn't become a really operational idea until Lloyd George came in with his new thinking. He said to Mark Sykes, let's think of a declaration that we can make that will please the Zionists and will give Jews around the world, in particular in Russia and the United States, an incentive to support the Allied war effort. Now, by the way, part of the reason this was a problem, and I'll stop at this point, is since the Allies, which included, as Jonathan pointed out, the British and the French, also included Russia, and since Russia was the most anti-Semitic government in the world, the Jews around the world were not enormously enthusiastic about the Allies. The Germans at the time there were a lot of Jews. The Germans during the war had a Jew in their cabinet, and so there were a lot of Jews around the world who were cool toward the Allies. And Lloyd George said, we want to get them warm in favor of the Allied cause. And that was, as Lloyd George explained in his own memoirs, the principal war-related motivation for the Balfour Declaration. We can also get into the fact that, I mean, as Jonathan pointed out, there was an interesting intellectual pro-Jewish tradition among certain British writers and political leaders, and that reinforced this strategic argument relating to the war. And there were also extremely important considerations that Lloyd George Balfour and others had about an endorsement of Zionism helping Britain after the war to retain control of Palestine. And all of those were part of the mix. But the number one motive that Lloyd George, in his own memoirs, explained motivated him was the propaganda value of trying to get the Jews, especially in Russia and America, to support the Allied war effort, because victory for the Allies would contribute to the Zionist cause.
Mike, in Churchill's Promised Land, you write about Churchill's views of Zionism as they changed over the course of his whole career. Yeah. So where was the 20th century's greatest man during these deliberations?
He was minister of munitions saying nothing. He was AWOL.
He wasn't, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, he wasn't in the government. He became minister of munitions soon thereafter, and then became an important defender of the Palestine Mandate when it came up for a vote. But he basically wasn't a player.
I thought he wasn't in the War Cabinet, but I thought he was Minister of Munitions, but I could be wrong, but that was my recollection, because he writes a memo that day, or I think Herbert Samuel wrote him a memo on the 2nd of November, and it had something to do with munitions, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Zionism. Could I first comment on Doug, although I could talk about Churchill for a second, which obviously is more my wheelhouse. I would say that I agree with what Doug said. I would just slightly modify. I'd add to it a little bit. First of all, when Lloyd George, I agree with him completely about the issue of the prestige. I just make it clear. It was Ottoman. This was Ottoman. This was Muslim-controlled, the Holy Land. So the idea that the Christians could control the Holy Land had value, separate from the Jews. The fact that General Allenby went into Jerusalem, I think December 9th, I believe, 1917. They rang the bells in some churches. They rang the bells in, I think, in Rome. It was a big deal. The Christians had conquered Jerusalem. It's not nothing. Don't forget the Crusades a little bit earlier in that, a millennium earlier. So it's an issue for a Christian issue because if, as you know, Doug, when the issue of what to do with the Holy Land first comes up, it starts really in early 1915. And Samuel puts forward a memo which actually says we should give it to the Jews. And actually a lot of the themes in that memo are echoed later by Churchill and by other officials. So I actually think it was an influential memo, even if it didn't go anywhere at that time. Actually, Churchill then is First Lord of the Admiralty, and it's around the time when they're about to attack Gallipoli or the Dardanelles to knock out the Ottomans out of the war. And Lord George says then that the British should take the Holy Land for the prestige value. And he says it again later on, I think in 1917. So Lord George is very conscious of this having nothing to do with the Jewish issue, the idea that the Christians. Now it's interesting, I remember I was somewhere and people asked, does anyone remember, it was a Christian group, do you remember when the Christians took Jerusalem? And no one remembered. I don't think it's a date that people remember now, but December 9th is when actually a Christian military took Jerusalem from the Muslims, the Ottomans. So the issue of prestige I agree with, and he was very conscious of that, especially as you said, Doug, correctly. The war was stalemate. It was a phenomenally bloody. And every Brit either had a relative or someone who was injured or killed. It was a terrible war. So they needed an uplifting thing, and Christian conquest of Jerusalem was one of them, separate from the issue of the Jews. There's another element I would add, which was the issue of getting out of Sykes-Picot. People refer to Sykes-Picot and think it's still around. Actually, as far as I understand, Sykes-Picot started to unravel soon after it was actually agreed in 1916. Lord George in particular didn't like it. He thought the French had too much, receded too much influence, including in Palestine. They were supposed to get some parts of what is now Israel, and he wanted a way to get out of that. And also promising it to the Jew would be a way to get rid of the French from the Holy Land. Now, even though the Brits and the French were allies in the war, they also were colonial rivals, so Lord George wanted to undercut the French. So that's another reason why the Balfour Declaration served a purpose, certainly for Lord George, was to undercut this, the Sykes-Picot agreement that gave the French, he thought, too much control. Also giving some of the Arabs their own states or so on was also, I think, part of this unraveling of Sykes-Picot. So that's another reason. Then there's the other reason, and you say correctly about getting the Jews on board, and I'm going to add a little more cynical twist to that, is that the issue is that why could Jews have so much influence? Now, Doug we talked about this the other day on the phone, so he has a different interpretation. As far as I understand it, because why do the Jews have any influence in Russia? And you had the Kerensky government, which is part of the alliance. You had the Bolsheviks that they were worried were going to come into control. Lenin said that this was an imperialist war, and if the Bolsheviks come into power, Russia's going to pull out. Well, that was something the British were very nervous about. So how do you undercut that ascent by the Bolsheviks? The thing is that I thought that during the war. You see this in Mel, and I see this very clearly right after the war. A lot of people thought the Bolsheviks were Jews. They were heavily influenced by Jews. They were supported by Jews. They were Jews. Essentially, it goes back to that idea I said before, where a lot of the revolutionary movements were seen as Jewish-supported, Jewish-inspired. It's not just an issue. You see this, there was discussion about this, about French turmoil earlier in the 19th century, that the Jews were somehow very involved in that too. So the idea was, give the Jews something, offer them a homeland, it will undercut support for the Bolsheviks and give those so-called international-leaning Jews a different focus than communism and let them focus on the Jewish homeland. So I see, and this gets to the delusions of Jewish power. To me, it's one of the ways, the few times...
Or the recognition of Jewish power.
Or it could be the recognition, except I don't see the Jews, the Bolsheviks as Jews. I mean, there were some prominent Jews. Obviously, Trotsky is a well-known Jew. And Churchill himself really believes this, actually, after the war. I mean, he refers to the Bolsheviks as Jews, the Jew commissars. I mean, that's how... And Churchill was actually philo-Semitic, and that's how he saw the Bolsheviks. I see it more as delusions of Jewish power helping the Jews. And also they thought, you know, they would also energize Woodrow Wilson to get more involved in the war. Basically, it was an appeal to Jewish power. It also was an appeal to some Jews in Palestine who were helping the war effort for the Brits, the Neely, spy network, and there was a Jewish legion there that was helping the Brits. So it was partly a reward for the Palestinian Jews, also to help Jewish power, appeal to Jewish power in Russia and America, which I see as fantastic, I mean as in unrealistic, and so that's how I view it. But I didn't really get to your Churchill point.
I think it's worth thinking about this from the point of view of British government officials at the time. Intelligence is never as good as you wish it were. And all kinds of things are happening, and the British government had only the vaguest understanding of major developments like the revolutions in Russia that in the beginning of 1917 overthrew the Tsar and set up the provisional government, and then at the end of 1917 got rid of the provisional government in favor of the Bolsheviks. Those were gigantic events, the understanding of which in London was very limited. It was a nightmare for the British to contemplate the Russian withdrawal from the war effort. Manpower was a gigantic problem during the war, and the biggest reserve of Allied manpower was Russia. And so the idea that the Russians would leave the war was a nightmare for the British. And the Bolsheviks were not in power until November, after the Balfour Declaration was issued. That's right. The main issue was what was the provisional government. The Tsar got overthrown in March. You should all remember that the Russians had a different calendar from the rest of the world. And so the February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar, occurred in March, and the Great October Revolution occurred in November. Okay, so the Tsar got overthrown, and the government was being run by socialists. The British didn't know that much about who these socialists were, but one thing they did know was there were a number of Jews among them. And it was not delusions of Jewish power. They didn't know who was in charge. By the way, I'm not sure that the Russians exactly knew who was in charge in this period. It was a crazy, wild period. And if you're the British and your nightmare is the Russians pulling out of the war, and you know that one new important element in Russian politics is Jews, and you can assume that some of them may be Zionists, what the hell? I mean, if your nightmare is that these people are going to pull out of the war, give them what you think might be a useful incentive to stay in the war. I don't think it requires anti-Semitic delusions of Jewish grandeur to make the calculation that in all of this uncertainty, you might as well toss out a Zionist argument for the Jews. Now, it happens to be, there was a guy, take one leading example, there was a guy named Pinchas Rutenberg, who is a fascinating character and had actually worked with a Russian journalist named Vladimir Jabotinsky to launch what became the British Jewish Legion in World War I. He went back to Russia, and when the Tsar got overthrown, he became a fairly high-ranking member of the Kerensky government. He was a passionate Zionist. And he was in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg when the Bolsheviks seized the Winter Palace. And he became a prisoner of the Bolsheviks, eventually got out, went to Palestine, and founded the Israel Electric Company. Today's Israel Electric Company was founded by Pinchas Rutenberg. His name is all over. I mean, if you go to Israel and you walk around in Jerusalem and you see the first Israeli power plant, his name is all over the historical signs. And he was in the Kerensky government. So the idea that it was crazy and anti-Semitic and delusions of anti-Semitic political power to think that you could appeal to a guy like Pinchas Rutenberg by saying that, you know, we the British are supporting Zionism, that's wrong. Now take the other case in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was a famously arrogant SOB. Highly idealistic, spoke beautiful things that resonated all around the world about progressive ideals and all the rest of that. But on an individual level, he was an impossible guy. Very, very self-assured and unpleasant. He had almost nothing nice to say about anybody. But there was one person that he revered and spoke reverentially about, and that was Louis Brandeis, whom he appointed to the Supreme Court as the first Jew on the Supreme Court. Louis Brandeis was a close friend and advisor of Woodrow Wilson. And Louis Brandeis was not merely a Jew and not merely a Zionist. He was the head of the Zionist organization in America. And when the British said, we want to try to give a little more energy to Woodrow Wilson, who entered the war in April 1917 very reluctantly, half-heartedly. By the way, does anybody know when the United States started major combat in World War I? We entered the war in April 1917. May of 1918. We took 13 months to field a force that entered into any kind of significant fighting. Woodrow Wilson was not, a strong, passionate, energetic supporter of the Allied cause. He had run for re-election on the famous slogan that he kept America out of the war. He preferred neutrality. He entered reluctantly. He didn't move quickly once he entered. And the British were looking to light a fire under him. And again, if you're the British government and you're sitting around saying, what can we do to influence Woodrow Wilson, and you know that one of the few people that he has ever said a nice thing about is Louis Brandeis, who was the head of the Zionist organization in America, it's not an anti-Semitic delusion about Jewish power to think, it might not be a bad idea to endorse Zionism. And that's the kind of thinking that you heard from Lloyd George in particular, even more than Balfour. And so anyway, now, by the way, many historians, including very serious people, have...
Excluding myself, of course.
No, I mean people who have written like definitive works on the Balfour Declaration have made the argument that Mike makes, that, that it's because it's kind of deliciously ironic to say, well, the British who were pro-Zionist were actually believing in exaggerated views of Jewish political power, and so in a way they were anti-Semitic, and isn't it cute that the pro-Zionists were anti-Semitic? Okay, I mean, everybody gets the irony. It's all cute, except I really think it does an injustice to the British government officials who had a perfectly rational basis for believing, and again, think of it as part of a worldwide propaganda campaign. Most of the books that write about Israel and Palestine tend to focus narrowly only on Israel and Palestine as if that was the only thing going on in the world. If you view it from Lloyd George's point of view, he's going to have a worldwide propaganda campaign appealing to anybody who might help the Allied cause. Under those circumstances, having as one small slice of that propaganda campaign, a campaign to appeal to Jews, given their particular influence in two of the key countries to the British, Russia and America, it's not irrational, it's not anti-Semitic, it's not delusional, it was perfectly sensible.
So I have just a quick rejoinder to that, just real fast. I'm sorry.
Let me just say, so on the question of the Balfour Declaration is the height of philo-Semitism versus the Balfour Declaration is the height of anti-Semitism.
All right.
Mike, you'll have the last word just for
real
a second,
quickly,
and then we'll move on.
Yeah, real quickly. Thanks, John. First of all, I'll just say that the Zionists themselves press this theme on British officials that you'll have influence in the United States. I wanted to make that clear, and I didn't add that before, and in Russia. I would say the Zionists were very effective propagandists at the time, something that I don't think most Zionists or pro-Israel people think today of the state of Israel. Actually, I think Israel's been lousy propagandists for a long time, but they seem pretty effective then. I think it started with Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, although Nachum Sokolov and that Martin Kramer wrote about in Mosaic recently. I think they were very effective about getting this idea across that, look, most Jews are all Zionists, which was not true at all. They said that, British officials thought that, British folks on the ground in Russia thought that, the military, the British military, the head British military, the head of the British War Office in Russia writes a memo in 1918 that says all the Jews here are Zionists. They thought that in England. It's not true at all. Most Jews were not Zionists. It was more split. You can't really gauge it. There weren't polls, but certainly there was a split. The Zionists were very effective in saying, we're all Zionists, we're representing the Jewish community, and two, you'll have a lot of help. And where I disagree with you, Doug, on this, I think that would have, your argument would be a little stronger, however, that has nothing, because these ideas persist beyond the war. The idea that the Bolsheviks are Jews persists whether Pinchas Rutenberg is in the Kerensky government or he's not in the Kerensky government. They thought the Bolsheviks were Jews, that the Russian government was Jewish.
Many of them were.
Yeah, but they weren't. They were anti-Zionist Jews,
right.
First of all.
That's true.
Right. So it could have just been a misunderstanding, but there were some Jewish that were, and there was a reason why there were a number, because the Tsar was so anti-Semitic. There were a lot of reasons why there were some Jews. It wasn't that, and there were Jews that supported Kerensky, but there were some. So that's what, and the idea that Jews are powerful in America, that outlasts the idea, whether with Woodrow Wilson and Brandeis, that persists for decades, the idea that you want to appeal to Washington, you appeal to the Jews. And I think that therefore, whether there's a close Jewish advisor to the president.
It's odd for, of all people, the president of JINSA to say that that's not sensible.
I'm not saying, I know that. I understand. I'm not saying, I'm aware of that, Doug. I thought about that. I'm not saying that Jews are not influential. I'm just saying that the idea, well, I'm trying to be a serious historian, of course. The idea that the Jews are disproportionately powerful and they could guide whether a country is more engaged in a war or whether they're going to leave the Allies and step out of the war, to me was absurd.
Well, to use a nice Christian phrase, you cast your bread upon the water. I mean, the government of Britain needed help.
They did.
They wanted help from numerous sources, one of which was the Jews,
Yeah.
wherever they were, who might be Zionist and might be motivated by a pro-Zionist declaration. Yeah. That's not to say that they simplistically assumed that all they needed to do was endorse Zionism and Woodrow Wilson would change his policy. Nobody was thinking in those crazy, stupid, mechanical terms. They were doing what they could do. I mean, if you imagine a bunch of guys sitting around a table, right, which is the British government, trying to figure out what can we do to shore up popular support and use influence around the world to help the Allied cause, it was perfectly rational to make this an element of a worldwide policy. That's all I'm saying. And that's not to say that there weren't anti-Semites who had crazy, exaggerated views of Jewish influence. Of course there were. And it's not to say that the Zionists were not willing to take advantage of that. Of course they were. But I'm saying the argument that the Balfour Declaration was fundamentally motivated not by rational concerns, but by delusions of Jewish political influence, I think that's wrong.
So what was the role of these Zionist thinkers and writers in Britain at the time? We've now tried to understand how the issuance of the Balfour Declaration unfurls from cabinet discussion. But the way that you hear, friends of Israel tell the story, like Chaim Weizmann thought this whole thing up himself. And
Yeah, well,
So-
the interesting thing is, I think the Jews, ironically, were much less influential even in Britain on this issue than the Zionist histories that you rightly cite, which claim that Chaim Weizmann did it all by himself. It's an interesting story. I don't mean to take anything away from Chaim Weizmann, who in fact was a brilliant political leader in this particular period. He was much less brilliant in later periods, but he really performed brilliantly in the 1917 period and for a few years thereafter in dealing with the British. But it's a fascinating thing. How did he become the leader of the Jews in this matter? I mentioned that when Lloyd George first became prime minister in December 1916, one of the first things he did is he asked Mark Sykes to sound out the Jews on what kind of a declaration would please them. So Mark Sykes had to figure out who were the Jews for this purpose, right? I mean, who speaks for the Jews? And so the first thing he did was he went to the leader of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, an Ashkenazi Jew, a rabbi who happened to be the leader of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in London, a guy named Moses Gaster. And he went and sounded him out. And he found the interactions extremely unpleasant, and Sykes wrote a memorandum saying Gaster was putting on pontifical airs. And he said, he's an impossible guy, I'm not going to deal with him. By the way, Sykes was a Roman Catholic, so the point about pontifical airs had special force when he said it. And so much for Moses Gaster as the main interlocutor with the British government. Then he went and he said, Herbert Samuel, highest ranking Jew in the British government, former Home Secretary, and an open, outspoken pro-Zionist, the only one in the higher reaches of the British government. And so we went to Herbert Samuel, and Sykes then wrote a memorandum saying, Samuel is too British and not Jewish enough to speak for the Jews. Then he went to Chaim Weizmann. And like in the Goldilocks story, Chaim Weizmann was just right. And Chaim Weizmann had the personality that just absolutely appealed to the British leadership. He also had an enormous amount of credibility because of an astonishing achievement, which was a coincidence, that he had been working before the war on a way to make acetone by fermenting potatoes rather than timber. And the British needed acetone to produce cordite, essentially gunpowder. And they had a crisis, and it was a really serious problem. I mean, basically World War I was determined by supplies. And so the British had this problem that the cordite that they used for all of their ammunition came from forests in Germany and Austria, which for obvious reasons were not available during the war. And so they needed a way to produce acetone not through timber. And the guy who happened to be the guy who had been working on this problem as a chemist was Chaim Weizmann. And he solved the problem for him. Now, it's also interesting to talk about coincidences. I mean, this is where people who get spiritual sometimes say these coincidences are, they become more than just coincidences. There were two government ministers in the Asquith government who were in charge of solving this acetone problem. One of them was the Minister of Munitions, David Lloyd George. The other was the First Lord of the Admiralty, Arthur Balfour. So the two guys that Weizmann worked with to solve this problem were Lloyd George and Balfour, who a few months later became Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Britain. It's a stunning, absolutely stunning coincidence. But that also helped. But basically, the way Chaim Weizmann became the leader of the Jews, and this is really a significant point, he was not pushed up by the Jewish masses as their leader. He was plucked from above. He was the Brits' favorite Jew for these purposes. And that's how he became the father of the Balfour Declaration.
Could I'm sorry, I'm going to disagree with Doug on this, so we'll have a little more. I think and I believe Lord George in his memoirs in the 30s cites the acetone issue was important to him, I believe. The problem is when Lord George wrote that, Zionism was extremely unpopular and he wanted to cite something else, I think. To me, the acetone issue with Weitzman is more of a myth, and I don't think it really had much influence. I don't think it hurt. First of all, Lloyd George had been involved with Zionism a decade earlier, so he was already engaged in the issue. He was already sympathetic.
So was Balfour.
Right, and Balfour. And I would say that, and what we didn't mention before, we were focusing on some of the negative issues, but you alluded to it earlier, Doug, is that England itself, for centuries, especially had thought about, there were writers, religious leaders that talked about Jewish restoration was important for religious reasons for the Christians. And that became particularly acute in the 19th century with the rise of evangelicalism in the 19th century. That was part of, I think, the British culture a bit to think about Jewish restoration, more in the context of religious reasons. But that was another reason that it was an undertone to the Balfour Declaration that's more positive, I think, than what we were talking about before. I didn't see any, I agree, it's an interesting coincidence, as you said, about Weitzman, but I saw no evidence except that something that Lloyd George says about 15 years later, that the acetone issue by Chaim Weitzman's contribution had any influence on this whatsoever. By the way, Churchill was also, interested in this issue. He was, to get back to the original, he became Minister of the Munitions, and I believe he was that in 1917, unless I'm wrong. And he said absolutely nothing about it. He had actually met Chaim Weitzman in 1904. And by the way, Moses Gaster, Rabbi Gaster was actually, had some influence in educating Churchill about Zionism a decade before. He was a very overbearing guy. But the thing is, Churchill himself, who was interested in the munitions issue later in the war, he wasn't a Zionist at all. He said Zionist things when he represented Northwest Manchester, where it had about 7-8% Jewish voter electorate. But he was philo-Semitic, and he was oriented to Zionism for various reasons, by things he read, by the influence of Benjamin Disraeli. But in 1917, even though he was Minister of Munitions and was interested in the munitions issue, he didn't say a word about Zionism. Now, he was in the war cabinet, so he had no influence anyway. But even for a couple of years later, when he's Secretary of Air and War, he's actually somewhat hostile, not necessarily hostile to Zion. Oh, by the way, when he's First Lord of the Admiralty in 1915, he writes a note and says that we should give Palestine to Belgium, because he felt bad for Belgium. They had been taken over by the Germans, and he wanted to keep the Palestine out of the great power rivalry, so let's give it to Belgium, which is one of the most utterly absurd ideas you could imagine. But then what makes him more of a Zionist is when he visits Palestine in 1921, and he sees what the Jews are doing. And then these old ideas that he started, that were fermenting in his mind, earlier part of the 20th century, starts coming back to him, and then he sees new ideas why he's a Zionist. But he himself doesn't become a Zionist yet in 21. So I just didn't see any evidence of the acetone issue or things. I think these are larger forces, and I think I think one of the challenges about the Balfour Declaration, and the reasons why, I think we both agree, Doug, that a lot had to do with wartime needs. And while there were these historical reasons in England why Brits, more than other peoples, were more oriented to the idea of Jewish restoration, but because they are near wartime goals, and that Zionism fit in those goals, once the war is over, and once Lloyd George stops being prime minister a few years later, the Zionist feelings of the governments are at a pretty much downward slope until you get to Neville Chamberlain, who essentially breaks the pledge with the 1939 white paper, and basically said there's not going to be a Jewish state. And he wants an Arab state there. He wants to limit Palestine. So whatever, we might disagree on what we're doing, but I think we both agree that they were wartime aims that were the impetus. There might have been philo-Semitism. There might have been other reasons why some Brits were sympathetic to a Jewish state. It had been part of the British thinking for a while about Jewish restoration. Benjamin Disraeli, a prominent conservative politician in the 19th century, one of the dominating ones who was Jewish born, he wrote about it, he talked about it. Daniel Deronda, I mean, George Eliot, there were writers like that. But the impetus was wartime aims. And therefore, once the war is over, what's the point for them? What's the value added for the British Empire? And then when they see the going gets rough, and then you see the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, they said, God, we got to step back from this. Now, Churchill, when he's colonial secretary, and under Lloyd George, he does a lot to implement the Balfour Declaration, and he changes his views when he's colonial secretary, and he sees the value of Zionism, not just for great issues. He sees it as advance of civilization. He sees value for the British Empire. He sees a lot of value to Zionism. But after Churchill's colonial secretary and Lord George goes away, it has its ups and downs. The Peel Commission might be the one up when they want to split the territory between the Arabs and the Jews for states, but it's pretty of a downward trend until you get to Chamberlain, who actually breaks it, and then Churchill's prime minister in the 40s and during the war, and he actually does a lot for Zionism, and then it reverts back to the Chamberlain view, and then you get Attlee Bevan. Attlee is prime minister, and it continues the Chamberlain policy of breaking the Balfour Declaration. So I think that is one of the challenges with the Balfour Declaration, because it satisfied near-term goals. Then once the war is over, the British government starts, a few years after that, I should say, the British government pretty much tries to back away from their pledge.
So I'd like to ask for Doug's response. I'd also like to have a few minutes when we can invite questions from friends in the audience. So let me just set up the next set of discussions that we should have, which, as Mike already alluded to try to bring the ramifications and echoes of Balfour into the contemporary moment. Now, everyone knows how unfair it was for the British to take Arab lands and give it to the Jews. So why do they do that?
The British leadership at the time that the Balfour Declaration was promulgated in 1917, and then later when the Balfour Declaration got incorporated into the Palestine Mandate, did not believe it was unfair to the Arabs. And they were emphatic on this point, because the arguments, the anti-Zionist arguments and the Arab arguments against the Balfour Declaration were made immediately. So the fact that it was controversial was known right from the beginning. And so it was answered by Lloyd George, Balfour, and others at the time. And their view was essentially this, and this is, I think, an important point for understanding the historical importance, even today, of the Balfour Declaration. The way the British leadership looked at it was this. Almost all the Arabs in the Near East fought for the Turks in the war. They were the enemy. The British had supported what they thought was going to be a large effort, turned out to be a very small effort, where the Sharif of Mecca had a small force that famously was advised by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and they fought to support the British in the war against the Turks. But the original thought when the British created that, the so-called Arab Revolt, was that the Arab Revolt would catch fire, and there would be millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of Arabs rallying to the banner of the Sharif of Mecca. It didn't happen. Nobody knows exactly what the numbers were. The most generous is maybe 20 or 30,000 people at one time or another did something out of millions. And there were no more than a few thousand at a time. And so the Arab Revolt was a bust, and the Arabs in general fought for the Turks. And as Lloyd George pointed out emphatically, the Arabs of Palestine fought entirely for the Turks. There were no Arabs from Palestine who were part of Faisal's army until the British conquered Palestine, at which point many Arabs who had been fighting for the Turks switched sides. But while there was a contest between the British and the Turks, all of the Arabs of Palestine who fought, Lloyd George points out, fought for the Turks. So despite that, the way the British looked at it, after World War I, the entire Near East was going to be put on the path toward independence for the Arabs. Now, the Arabs at the time, there were no countries. Right? The whole Middle East was part of the Ottoman Empire. So there were no Arab countries. And the way the British looked at it is whether it's one country as the Arab nationalists wanted, their slogan was unity and independence. So they were arguing for one large Arab kingdom from Turkey to the Indian Ocean. So whether it was going to be one large country or several countries, the Arabs were going to be put on the path toward self-determination and national independence throughout the Middle East. A tiny piece of land, what Balfour referred to as a small notch of land, which was Palestine on both sides of the Jordan River, they said they were going to set aside because the British had an interest in controlling that in order to protect Egypt. Egypt was extremely important for the British because the Suez Canal was the main connection between Britain and India, which the British owned. And so to protect Egypt, they wanted to retain control of Palestine. And so they and in order to justify retaining control of Palestine without doing it on just nakedly imperialist grounds, they wanted a humanitarian and idealistic reason to control Palestine. It helped to say we're doing it in order to solve this long-standing international humanitarian problem known as the Jewish problem. And so all these threads came together. And the way the British looked at it is the whole Middle East will go to the Arabs, except for this small notch of land, which will be used to solve the Jewish problem. And in any event, it's a small notch of land in which the Christians, as Mike rightly pointed out, have an extremely strong interest, so giving it to the predominantly Muslim Arabs didn't seem like a great idea in any event, even without regard to the Jews. And so their view was that. Now, the other thing that I think is extremely important is the people who were making these decisions in London about the Near East were making decisions like this for the whole world. In other words, when World War I ended, a large part of the map of the world had to be redrawn. Think of what was happening in Europe. The defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire earlier, the Russian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire meant that there were enormous swaths of land where new countries were going to be created. And everywhere that new countries were going to be created, there were issues of who's going to live on which side of the boundary. And there was an enormous amount of thought given to what was called the minorities problem. And so take, for example, the Hungarians who got defeated. There was going to be a Hungary created in the territory that used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But there were the question of what were the boundaries of Hungary going to be? Well, the boundary with Romania, wherever you drew the boundary, there were going to be either some Romanians on the Hungarian side of the line or Hungarians on the Romanian side of the line. Likewise with Czechoslovakia, likewise with Yugoslavia, all new countries. Because the Hungarians were on the losing side of the war, when the Allies drew those lines, they drew them to the disadvantage of Hungary. That's the reason that there are hundreds of thousands of Hungarians in Romania to this day, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians in Yugoslavia, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians in Czechoslovakia. And what the British decided was necessary was the Hungarians were going to have self-determination for Hungary in Hungary. But the Hungarians who lived in Romania or Yugoslavia, they were entitled to have their individual rights protected. But they weren't entitled to have Hungarian national rights in Romania. That same principle was applied in the Near East. The Arabs were going to have vast areas that were going to be Arab predominant, Arab majority countries. They were going to have national independence and self-determination there. And in the area where there was going to be a Jewish majority eventually in the Holy Land, the Arabs who lived there would have their individual rights protected. And the model that was used in the Middle East was precisely the model that they were using in Europe. And again, one of the problems with books about the Arab-Israeli conflict is they tend to focus on Palestine and only Palestine and not have the same perspective that the people who were actually making these decisions in London had, which was a global perspective. And by the way, it wasn't mentioned, but in case anybody's wondering, like, why do I know this stuff? I'm writing a book on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I've been doing archival research in all of this. And that's why all of this stuff is at my fingertips. I don't mean to have a unfair advantage
No, I said
over,
your research is fresher
over a scholar like Mike, who's spending most of his time on other things. I'm spending a lot of my time right now on these things. I think this point about the way they viewed fairness toward the Arabs is extremely important. They did not believe they were being unfair. In fact, Balfour and Lloyd George both said that of all the peoples in World War I who lost the war, who fought on the enemy's side, nobody comes close to benefiting as greatly from the war as the Arabs. And that was their view. It wasn't that the Arabs were mistreated.
So the official time for our panel has expired. I would love to invite questions, but I don't want to stand in Harris's way for fear. But perhaps Mike and Doug would answer some questions independently afterwards. My friends, please join me in thanking them.
Thanks.